Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. Chapter 9. A Tale. A week passed, during which Cecilia, however sad, spent her time as usual with the family, denying to herself all voluntary indulgence of grief, and forbearing to seek consolation from solitude or relief from tears. She never named Delvile, she begged Mrs. Charlton never to mention him. She called to her aid the account she had received from Dr. Lister of his firmness, and endeavoured by an emulous ambition to fortify her mind from the weakness of depression and regret. This week, a week of struggle with all her feelings, was just elapsed when she received by the post the following letter from Mrs. Delvile. To Miss Beverley, Bristol, October 21st. My sweet young friend will not, I hope, be sorry to hear of my safe arrival at this place. To me every account of her health and welfare will ever be the intelligence I shall most covet to receive. Yet I mean not to ask for it in return. To chance I will trust for information, and I only write now to say I shall write no more. Too much for thanks is what I owe to you, and what I think of you is beyond all power of expression. Do not, then, wish me ill as I have seemed to merit of you, for my own heart is almost broken by the tyranny I have been compelled to practise upon yours. And now let me bid a long adieu to you, my admirable Cecilia. You shall not be tormented with a useless correspondence, which can only awaken painful recollections, or give rise to yet more painful new anxieties. Fervently will I pray for the restoration of your happiness, to which nothing can so greatly contribute as that wise, that uniform command, so feminine yet so dignified, you maintain over your passions, which often I have admired, though never so feelingly as at this conscious moment, when my own health is a sacrifice for emotions most fatally unrestrained. Send to me no answer, even if you have the sweetness to wish it. Every new proof of the generosity of your nature is to me but a new wound. Forget us therefore wholly, alas! You have only known us for sorrow. Forget us, dear and invaluable Cecilia, though ever, as you have nobly deserved, must you be fondly and gratefully remembered by Augusta Delvile. The attempted philosophy and laboured resignation of Cecilia this letter destroyed. The struggle was over, the apathy was at an end, and she burst into an agony of tears, which, finding the vent they had long sought, now flowed unchecked down her cheeks, sad monitors of the weakness of reason opposed to the anguish of sorrow. A letter at once so caressing, yet so absolute, forced its way to her heart, in spite of the fortitude she had flattered herself was its guard. In giving up Delvile, she was satisfied of the propriety of seeing him no more, and convinced that even to talk of him would be folly and imprudence. But to be told that for the future they must remain strangers to the existence of each other, there seemed in this a hardship, a rigour that was insupportable. "Oh, what," cried she, "is human nature? In its best state how imperfect! That a woman such as this, so noble in character, so elevated in sentiment, with heroism to sacrifice to her sense of duty the happiness of a son, whom with joy she would die to serve, can herself be thus governed by prejudice, thus enslaved, thus subdued by opinion? Yet never, even when miserable, unjust or irrational. Her grief was unmixed with anger, and her tears streamed not from resentment, but affliction. The situation of Mrs. Delvile, however different, she considered to be as wretched as her own. She read therefore with sadness, but not bitterness, her farewell, and received not with disdain, but with gratitude, her sympathy. Yet though her indignation was not irritated, her sufferings were doubled, by a farewell so kind, yet so despotic, a sympathy so affectionate, yet so hopeless. In this first indulgence of grief which she had granted to her disappointment, she was soon interrupted by a summons downstairs to a gentleman. Unfit and unwilling to be seen, she begged that he might leave his name and appoint a time for calling again. Her maid brought her the answer that he believed his name was unknown to her, and desired to see her now, unless she was employed in some matter of moment. She then put up her letter, and went into the parlour, and there, to her infinite amazement, beheld Mr. Albany. "How little, sir," she cried, "did I expect this pleasure?" "This pleasure!" repeated he. "Do you call it? What strange abuse of words! What causeless trifling with honesty! Is language of no purpose but to wound the ear with untruths? Is the gift of speech only granted us to pervert the use of understanding? I can give you no pleasure. I have no power to give it to anyone. You can give none to me. The whole world could not invest you with the means. Well, sir, said Cecilia, who had little spirit to defend herself, I will not vindicate the expression, but of this I will unfeignedly assure you, I am at least as glad to see you just now as I should be to see anybody. Your eyes, cried he, are red, your voice is inarticulate, young, rich, attractive, the world at your feet, that world yet untried and its falsehood unknown. How have you thus found means to anticipate misery? Which way have you uncovered the cauldron of human woes? Fatal and early anticipation. That cover once removed can never be replaced. Those woes, those boiling woes, will pour out upon you continuously, and only when your heart ceases to beat will their ebullition cease to torture you. Alas, cried Cecilia, shuddering, how cruel, yet how true! Why went you, cried he, to the cauldron? It came not to you. Misery seeks not the man, but man misery. He walks out in the sun, but stops not for a cloud. Confident he pursues his way, till the storm which, gathering, he might have avoided, bursts over his devoted head. Scared and amazed, he repents his temerity. He calls, but it is then too late. He runs, but it is thunder which follows him. Such is the presumption of man. As such at once is the arrogance and shallowness of his nature. And thou, simple and blind, hast thou, too, followed whither fancy has led thee, unheeding that thy career was too vehement for tranquillity, nor missing that lovely companion of youth's early innocence, till, adventurous and unthinking, thou hast lost her for ever? In the present weak state of Cecilia's spirits, this attack was too much for her, and the tears she had just and with difficulty restrained again forced their way down her cheeks as she answered, It is but too true. I have lost her for ever. Poor thing, said he, while the rigour of his countenance was softened into the gentlest commiseration. So young, looking too so innocent. 'Tis hard. And is nothing left thee? No small remaining hope, to cheat, humanely cheat, that thy yet not wholly extinguished credulity? Cecilia wept without answering. Let me not, said he, waste my compassion upon nothing. Compassion is with me no effusion of affectation. Tell me then if thou deservest it, or if thy misfortunes are imaginary, and thy grief is factitious. Factitious? Repeated she. Good heaven! Answer me then these questions, in which I shall comprise the only calamities for which sorrow has no control, or none from human motives. Tell me then, have you lost by death the friend of your bosom? No. Is your fortune dissipated by extravagance, and your power of relieving the distressed at an end? No. The power and the will are, I hope, equally undiminished. Oh, then, unhappy girl, have you been guilty of some vice, and hangs remorse thus heavy on your conscience? No, no. Thank heaven, to that misery at least I am a stranger. His countenance now again resumed its severity, and in the sternest manner. Whence, then, he said, these tears? And what is this caprice you dignify with the name of sorrow? Strange wantonness of indolence and luxury, perverse repining of ungrateful plenitude. Oh, hast thou known what I have suffered? Could I lessen what you have suffered, said Cecilia, I should sincerely rejoice. But heavy indeed must be your affliction, if mine in its comparison deserves to be styled caprice. Caprice, repeated he, 'tis joy, 'tis ecstasy compared with mine. Thou hast not in licentiousness wasted thy inheritance. Thou hast not by remorse barred each avenue to enjoyment, nor yet has the cold grave seized the beloved of thy soul. Neither, said Cecilia, I hope are the evils you have yourself sustained so irredeemable. Yes, I have borne them all. Have borne, I bear them still. I shall bear them while I breathe. I may rue them, perhaps, yet longer. Good God, cried Cecilia, shrinking, what a world is this, how full of woe and wickedness! Yet thou, too, canst complain, cried he, though happy in life's only blessing, innocence. Thou, too, canst murmur, though stranger to death's only terror, sin. Oh, yet if thy sorrow is unpolluted with guilt, be regardless of all else, and rejoice in thy destiny. But who, cried she, deeply sighing, shall teach me such a lesson of joy, when all within rises to oppose it? I, cried he, will teach it thee, for I will tell thee my own sad story. Then wilt thou find how much happier is thy lot, then wilt thou raise thy head in thankful triumph. Oh no, triumph comes not so lightly. Yet if you will venture to trust me with some account of yourself, I shall be glad to hear it, and much obliged by the communication. I will, he answered, whatever I may suffer. To awaken then from this dream of fancied sorrow, I will open all my wounds, and thou shalt probe them with fresh shame. No, indeed, cried Cecilia with quickness. I will not hear you if the relation will be so painful. Upon me this humanity is lost, said he, since punishment and penitence alone give me comfort. I will tell thee therefore my crimes, that thou mayest know thy own felicity, lest, ignorant it means nothing but innocence, thou shouldst lose it, unconscious of its value. Listen then to me, and learn what misery is. Guilt is alone the basis of lasting unhappiness. Guilt is the basis of mine, and therefore I am a wretch for ever. Cecilia would again have declined hearing him, but he refused to be spared, and as her curiosity had long been excited to know something of his history, and the motives of his extraordinary conduct, she was glad to have it satisfied, and gave him the utmost attention. I will not speak to you of my family, said he. Historical accuracy would little answer to either of us. I am a native of the West Indies, and I was early sent hither to be educated. While I was yet at university, I saw, I adored, and I pursued the fairest flower that ever put forth its sweetest buds, the softest heart that ever was broken by ill usage. She was poor and unprotected, the daughter of a villager. She was untaught and unpretending, the child of simplicity. But 15 summers had she bloomed, and her heart was an easy conquest. Yet, once made mine, it resisted all allurement to infidelity. My fellow students attacked her. She was assaulted by all the arts of seduction. Flattery, bribery, supplication, all were employed, yet all failed. She was wholly my own, and with sincerity so attractive, I determined to marry her in defiance of all worldly objections. The sudden death of my father called me hastily to Jamaica. I feared leaving this treasure unguarded, yet in decency could neither marry nor take her directly. I pledged my faith, therefore, to return to her, as soon as I had settled my affairs, and I left to a bosom friend the inspection of her conduct in my absence. To leave her was madness. To trust in man was madness. O hateful race! How has the world been abhorrent to me since that time! I have loathed the light of the sun. I have shrunk from the commerce of my fellow creatures. The voice of man I have detested, his sight I have abominated. But oh, more than all should I be abominated myself. When I came to my fortune, intoxicated with sudden power, I forgot this fair blossom. I revelled in licentiousness and vice, and left it exposed and forlorn. Riot succeeded riot, till a fever, incurred by my own intemperance, first gave me time to think. Then was she revenged, for then first remorse was my portion. Her image was brought back to my mind with frantic fondness and bitterest contrition. The moment I recovered, I returned to England. I flew to claim her, but she was lost. No one knew whither she was gone. The wretch I had trusted pretended to know least of all. Yet, after a furious search, I traced her to a cottage where he had concealed her himself. When she saw me, she screamed and would have flown. I stopped her, and told her I came faithfully and honourably to make her my wife. Her own faith and honour, though sullied, were not extinguished, for she instantly acknowledged the fatal tale of her undoing. Did I recompense this ingenuousness, this unexampled, this beautiful sacrifice to intuitive integrity? Yes, with my curses. I loaded her with execrations. I reviled her in language the most opprobrious. I insulted her even for her confession. I invoked all evil upon her from the bottom of my heart. She knelt at my feet. She implored my forgiveness and compassion. She wept with the bitterness of despair, and yet I spurned her from me. Spurned? Let me not hide my shame. I barbarously struck her. Nor single was the blow. It was doubled. It was reiterated. O wretch! Unyielding and unpitying, where shall hereafter be clemency for thee? So fair a form, so young a culprit, so infamously seduced, so humbly penitent. In this miserable condition, helpless and deplorable, mangled by these savage hands, and reviled by this inhuman tongue, I left her, in search of the villain who had destroyed her. but cowardly as treacherous he had absconded. Repenting my fury, I hastened to her again. The fierceness of my cruelty shamed me when I grew calmer. The softness of her sorrow melted me upon reflection. I returned, therefore, to soothe her, but again she was gone. Terrified with expectation of insult, she hid herself from all my inquiries. I wandered in search of her long years to no purpose, regardless of my affairs, and of all things but that pursuit. At length I thought I saw her, in London alone, and walking in the streets of midnight. I fearfully followed her, and followed her into a house of infamy. The wretches by whom she was surrounded were noisy and drinking. They heeded me little, but she saw and knew me at once. She did not speak, nor did I, but in 2 moments she fainted and fell. Yet did I not help her. The people took their own measures to recover her, and when she was again able to stand, would have removed her to another apartment. I then went forward, and forcing them away from her with all strength of desperation, I turned to the unhappy sinner, who to chance only seemed to leave what became of her, and cried, "From this scene of vice and horror let me yet rescue you. You look still unfit for such society. Trust yourself, therefore, to me." I seized her hand. I almost dragged her away. She trembled. She could scarce totter, but neither consented nor refused, neither shed a tear nor spoke a word, and her countenance presented a picture of affright, amazement, and horror. I took her to a house in the country, each of us silent the whole way. I gave her an apartment and a female attendant, and ordered for her every convenience I could suggest. I stayed myself in the same house, but distracted with remorse for the guilt and ruin into which I had terrified her, I could not bear her sight. In a few days her maid assured me the life she led must destroy her, that she would taste nothing but bread and water, never spoke, never slept. Alarmed by this account, I flew into her apartment. Pride and resentment gave way to pity and fondness, and I besought her to take comfort. I spoke, however, to a statue. She replied not, nor seemed to hear me. I then humbled myself to her as in the days of her innocence and first power, supplicating her notice, entreating that even her commiseration. All was to no purpose. She neither received nor repulsed me, and was alike inattentive to exhortation and to prayer. Whole hours did I spend at her feet, vowing never to arise till she spoke to me. All in vain. She seemed deaf, mute, insensible, her face unmoved, a settled despair fixed in her eyes, those eyes that had never looked at me but with dove-like softness and compliance. She sat constantly in one chair. She never changed her dress. No persuasions could prevail with her to lie down, and at meals she just swallowed so much dry bread as might save her from dying for want of food. What was the distraction of my soul? To find her bent upon this course to her last hour. Quick came that hour, but never will it be forgotten. Rapidly it was gone, but eternally it will be remembered. When she felt herself expiring, she acknowledged she had made a vow, upon entering the house, to live speechless and motionless as a penance for her offences. I kept her loved corpse till my own senses failed me. It was then only torn from me, and I have lost all recollection of 3 years of my existence. Cecilia shuddered at this hint, yet was not surprised by it. Mr. Gosport had acquainted her he had been formerly confined, and his flightiness, wildness, and florid language, an extraordinary way of life, had long led her to suspect his reason had been impaired. "The scene to which my memory first leads me back," he continued, "is visiting her grave. Solemnly upon it I returned her vow, though not by one of equal severity. To her poor remains did I pledge myself, that the day should never pass in which I would receive nourishment, nor the night come in which I should take rest, till I had done or zealously attempted to do some service to a fellow creature. For this purpose have I wandered from city to city, from town to the country, and from the rich to the poor. I go into every house where I can gain admittance. I admonish all who will hear me. I shame even those who will not. I seek the distressed wherever they are hid. I follow the prosperous to beg a mite to serve them. I look for the dissipated in public, where, amidst their licentiousness, I check them. I pursue the unhappy in private, where I counsel and endeavour to assist them. My own power is small, my relations during my sufferings limiting me to an annuity. But there is no one I scruple to solicit, and by zeal I supply ability. Oh, life of hardship and penance! Laborious, toilsome, and restless! But I have merited no better, and I will not repine at it. I have vowed that I will endure it, and I will not be forsworn. One indulgence alone from time to time I allow myself, 'Tis music, which has power to delight me even to rapture. It quiets all anxiety. It carries me out of myself. I forget through it every calamity, even the bitterest anguish. Now then, that thou hast heard me, tell me, hast thou cause of sorrow?" "Alas," cried Cecilia, "this indeed is a picture of misery, to make my lot seem all happiness." "Art thou thus open to conviction?" cried he mildly, "and dost thou not fly the voice of truth? For truth and reproof are one." "No, I would rather seek it. I feel myself wretched, however inadequate may be the cause. I wish to be more resigned, and if you can instruct me how, I shall thankfully attend you." "O yet uncorrupted creature!" cried he, "with joy will I be thy monitor, joy long untasted. Many hours have I wished to serve, all hitherto have rejected my offices. Too honest to flatter them, they have not the fortitude to listen to me. Too low to advance them, they had not the virtue to bear with me. You alone have I found pure enough not to fear inspection, and good enough to wish to be better. Yet words alone will not content me. I must also have deeds. Nor will your purse, however readily opened, suffice. You must give to me also your time and your thoughts, for money sent by others to others only will afford relief. To lighten your own cares, you must distribute it yourself." "You shall find me," said she, "a docile pupil, and most glad to be instructed how my existence may be useful." "Happy, then," cried he, "was the hour that brought me to this county. Yet not in search of you did I come, but of the mutable and ill-fated Belfield. Erring yet ingenious young man! What a lesson to the vanity of talents, to the gaiety, the brilliance of wit, is the sight of that green fallen plant! Not sapless by age, nor withered by disease, but destroyed by want of pruning, and bending, breaking by its own luxuriousness." "And where, sir, is he now?" "Labouring wilfully in the field, with those who labour compulsatorily. Such are we all by nature, discontented, perverse, and changeable. Though all have not courage to appear so, and few like Belfield are worth watching when they do. He told me he was happy. I knew it could not be, but his employment was inoffensive, and I left him without reproach. In this neighbourhood I heard of you, and found your name was coupled with praise. I came to see if you deserved it. I have seen, and am satisfied." "You are not, then, very difficult, for I have yet done nothing. How are we to begin these operations you propose? You have awakened me by them to an expectation of pleasure, which nothing else, I believe, could just now have given me." "We will work," cried he, "together, till not a woe shall remain upon your mind. The blessings of the fatherless, the prayers of little children, shall heal all your wounds with balm of sweetest fragrance. When sad, they shall cheer; when complaining, they shall soothe you. We will go to their roofless houses and see them repaired. We will exclude from their dwellings the inclemency of the weather. We will clothe them from cold. We will rescue them from hunger. The cries of distress shall be changed to notes of joy. Your heart shall be enraptured. Mine too shall revive. Oh, whither am I wandering? I am painting an Elysium, and while I idly speak, some fainting object dies for want of succour. Farewell. I will fly to the abodes of wretchedness, and come to you tomorrow to render them the abodes of happiness." He then went away. This singular visit was for Cecilia most fortunately timed. It almost surprised her out of her peculiar grief, by the view which it opened to her of general calamity. Wild, flighty, and imaginative as was his language and his counsels, their morality was striking, and their benevolence was affecting. Taught by him to compare her state with that of at least half her species, she began more candidly to weigh what was left with what was withdrawn, and found the balance in her favour. The plan he had presented to her of good works was consonant to her character and inclinations, and the active charity in which he proposed to engage her reanimated her fallen hopes, though to far different subjects from those which had depressed them. Any scheme of worldly happiness would have sickened and disgusted her, but her mind was just in the situation to be impressed with elevated piety, and to adopt any design in which virtue humoured melancholy. Chapter 10. A Shock. Cecilia passed the rest of the day in fanciful projects of beneficence. She determined to wander with her romantic new ally whithersoever he would lead her, and to spare neither fortune, time, nor trouble in seeking and relieving the distressed. Not all her attempted philosophy had calmed her mind like this plan. In merely refusing indulgence to grief, she had only locked it up in her heart, where, eternally struggling for vent, she was almost overpowered by restraining it. But now her affliction had no longer her whole faculties to itself. The hope of doing good, the pleasure of easing pain, the intention of devoting her time to the service of the unhappy, once more delighted her imagination. That source of promissory enjoyment, which though often obstructed, is never in youth exhausted. She would not give Mrs. Charlton the unnecessary pain of hearing the letter with which she had been so much affected, but she told her of the visit of Albany, and pleased her with the account of their scheme. At night, with less sadness than usual, she retired to rest. In her sleep she bestowed riches, and poured plenty upon the land. She humbled the oppressor, she exalted the oppressed. Slaves were raised to dignities, captives restored to liberty. Beggars saw smiling abundance, and wretchedness was banished the world. From a cloud in which she was supported by angels, Cecilia beheld these wonders, and while enjoying the glorious illusion, she was awakened by her maid with news that Mrs. Charlton was dying. She started up, and undressed, was running to her apartment, when the maid, calling to stop her, confessed she was already dead. She had made her exit in the night, but the time was not exactly known. Her own maid, who slept in the room with her, going early to her bedside to inquire how she did, found her cold and motionless, and could only conclude that a paralytic stroke had taken her off. Happily and in good time had Cecilia been somewhat recruited by one night of refreshing slumbers and flattering dreams, for the shock she now received promised her not soon another. She lost in Mrs. Charlton a friend, whom nearly from her infancy she had considered as a mother, and by whom she had been cherished with tenderness almost unequalled. She was not a woman of bright parts or much cultivation, but her heart was excellent, and her disposition was amiable. Cecilia had known her longer than her memory could look back, though the earliest circumstances she could trace were kindnesses received from her. Since she had entered into life and found the difficulty of the part she had to act, to this worthy old lady alone had she unbosomed her secret cares. Though little assisted by her counsel, she was always certain of her sympathy, and while her own superior judgment directed her conduct, she had the relief of communicating her schemes and weighing her perplexities with a friend to whom nothing that concerned her was indifferent, and whose greatest wish and chief pleasure was the enjoyment of her conversation. If left to herself in the present period of her life, Mrs. Charlton had certainly not been the friend of her choice. The delicacy of her mind and the refinement of her ideas had now rendered her fastidious, and she would have looked out for elegancies and talents to which Mrs. Charlton had no pretensions. But those who live in the country have little power of selection. Confined to a small circle, they must be content with what it offers, and however they may idolize extraordinary merit when they meet with it, they must not regard it as essential to friendship, for in their circumscribed rotation, whatever may be their discontent, they can make but little change. Such had been the situation to which Mrs. Charlton and Mrs. Harrel owed the friendship of Cecilia. Greatly their superior in understanding and intelligence, had the candidates for her favour been more numerous, the election had not fallen upon either of them. But she became known to both before discrimination made her difficult, and when her enlightened mind discerned their deficiencies, they had already an interest in her affections, which made her see them with lenity, and though sometimes perhaps conscious she should not have chosen them from many, she adhered to them with sincerity, and would have changed them for none. Mrs. Harrel, however, too weak for similar sentiments, forgot her when out of sight, and by the time they met again was insensible to everything but show and dissipation. Cecilia, shocked and surprised, first grieved from disappointed affection, and then lost that affection in angry contempt. But her fondness for Mrs. Charlton had never known abatement, as the kindness which had excited it had never known allay. She had loved her first from childish gratitude, but that love, strengthened and confirmed by confidential intercourse, was now as sincere and affectionate as if it had originated from sympathetic admiration. Her loss, therefore, was felt with the utmost severity, and neither seeing nor knowing any means of replacing it, she considered it as irreparable, and mourned it with bitterness. When the first surprise of this cruel stroke was somewhat lessened, She sent an express to Mr. Monckton with the news and entreated to see him immediately. He came without delay, and she begged his counsel what steps she ought herself to take in consequence of this event. Her own house was still unprepared for her. She had of late neglected to hasten the workmen, and almost forgotten her intention of entering it. It was necessary, however, to change her abode immediately. She was no longer in the house of Mrs. Charlton, but of her granddaughters and co-heiresses, each of whom she disliked, and upon neither of whom she had any claim. Mr. Monckton then, with the quickness of a man who utters a thought at the very moment of its projection, mentioned a scheme upon which during his whole ride he had been ruminating, which was that she would instantly remove to his house, and remain there till settled to her own satisfaction. Cecilia objected her little right of surprising Lady Margaret, but without waiting to discuss it, lest new objections should arise, he quitted her, to fetch himself from her ladyship an invitation he meant to insist upon her sending. Cecilia, though heartily disliking this plan, knew not at present what better to adopt, and thought anything preferable to going again to Mrs. Harrel, since that only could be done by feeding the anxiety of Mr. Arnott. Mr. Monckton soon returned with the message of his own fabrication, for his lady, though obliged to receive whom he pleased, took care to guard inviolate the independence of speech, sullenly persevering in refusing to say anything, or persevering perversely saying only what he least wished to hear. Cecilia then took a hasty leave of the Miss Charltons, who, little affected by what they had lost, and eager to examine what they had gained, parted from her gladly, and with a heavy heart and weeping eyes, borrowed for the last time the carriage of her late worthy old friend, and for ever quitting her hospitable house, sorrowfully set out for the Grove. End of the 4th volume. Well, there we go. We only have 2 volumes, 1 volume left, and 2 books, which means we have in fact 21 chapters left out of many. And you will be, I'm sure, pleased to know that I have almost certainly chosen which book to read next, and it is going to be very different to this. Have a good evening.